Ecclesiastes chapter 12. And let's go read through this. Chapter 12, verse number 1. Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. While the sun or the light of the moon or the stars be not darkened, or the clouds return after the rain. In the days when the keepers of the house shall tremble, and the strong men shall blow themselves, and the shall bow themselves, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those that look out of the windows be darkened, and the doors shall be shut in the streets, when the sound of the grinding is low, and he shall rise up at the voice of the bird, and all the daughters of music shall be brought low. And when they shall be afraid of that which is high, and fear shall be in the way, and the almond tree shall flourish, and the grasshopper shall be a burden, and desire shall fail, because man goeth to his long home, and the mourners go about the streets. Or ever the silver cord be loosed, or the golden bowl be broken, or the pitcher be broken at the fountain, or the wheel be broken at the cistern. The earth, or then shall the dust return to earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, all is vanity. And moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge, yet he gave good heed, and he sought out, and he set in order many proverbs. The preacher sought to find out acceptable words, and that which was written was upright, even words of truth. The words of the wise are as goads, and nails fastened by masters of assembly, which are given from one shepherd. And further, by these, my son, be admonished, of making many books there is no end, and the study is a weariness of the flesh. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God, and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. And so Solomon here is bringing the book of Ecclesiastes to a close. And so he does this in kind of two different sections. So to begin with, he finishes with by first taking a look beyond the sun. Now remember, we are beyond the sun now, taking a look beyond the sun to its creator, and he tells us to remember him. And so remember now thy Creator. And so to remember him isn't just a good thing to do every once in a while, but to remember him is to make him a priority. It is to make it so that our care for God is more from the cares of the world. And Solomon gets this and understands this because he spent so much time, 90% of this book is talking about kind of the cares of the world and the vanity that arrives from that. And so finally, Solomon, after kind of almost beating you down chapter after chapter with the cares of this world, finally gets to the point where he says, look beyond all that to the Creator. Look to the one who made the world and make him a priority. Remember him. Kidner, he says, for our part, to remember him is no perfunctory or purely mental act. It is to drop our pretense of self-sufficiency and commit ourselves to him. In fact, that word is why I put this in here, that word commit. It is a committal. This is what we're supposed to be doing. To commit ourselves to him is, again, this is not just a fleeting moment, a fleeting thought every once in a while. No, everything that we do flows from this commitment. Everything we do flows from this fact that we remember our God, remember the one who made us. In a New Testament context, we remember the one who sent his Son, and the Son who was willing to come and die for us. And so everything we do flows from this commitment. And so what Solomon does then is he makes a point then to begin this committal, to begin this commitment as early as possible. And so we remember him not only with our whole being, but with our whole life. And so we start in our youth, or we should, let's put it that way, we should start in our youth, for it is then we can serve with vigor and we establish the habits of proper remembering, right? And in fact, it's so much easier to learn things when you're a younger person, because then you can establish habits and all the things that lend itself well to aging with those things. And so we serve as soon as we can, for the day comes when the serving, and I wanted to make sure we understand this, the serving here on earth ends. The serving never ends, but the serving here on earth ends. And so Solomon takes several verses here, and he kind of gives a poetic look at the process of aging, ultimately leading to death. And the reason he does this is, again, to look at why he is commending to start this remembering when you're young. Because there's not only just from the simple fact that you have more time to do it, but also, again, you have more strength and ability to do it because part of the natural process of aging is the loss of some of these things. And so the process of aging leads, and again, he does this very poetically, but just kind of trying to boil down his points. It is the process where day slowly turns to night and sunshine to rain, where the body moves from strength to weakness and loss of functionality, where once caution was thrown to the wind, now there is fearfulness, is what he says in verse 5. Also, when they shall be afraid of that which is high, right? Things that we might have thought simple, you get to a certain age where things are more difficult, and you think of somebody somebody using a walker, somebody in a wheelchair, right? Steps become difficulty, where when you're young, you run up the steps, and so it's this is the thought process that Solomon is going through, but it all leads to the point where men going to his long home and the mourners go about the streets. Now, what the world does is the world likes to think of this as just this terrible thing, and we know that it is the inevitable end of all men, and it is ultimately because of sin. However, there is a beauty in its own right in death of in itself. Because Solomon ends with this thought. He says, then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, but also the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. Right? And so, immediately I begin to think of Psalm 116, where it says, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. This is a verse we're probably all very familiar with. If you've ever been to a funeral, you've heard the verse. But it is very true. And so it is whereas the death of a saint, or the death of a loved one, it is a time for mourning, appropriately so. It is a time to remember their life, but also it's a time of rejoicing because they are now with their Creator. But also there's a flip side of that, because that comfort is only for the Christian. That comfort is only for the ones who know him, because on the other side of that, in Matthew 25, Jesus says, then shall he say unto them on the left hand, depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. And so that's the end of those who don't know him. And so the comfort comes in, what? Remembering our Creator. That's where the comfort comes in. And being earnest about our serving and worshiping of him at such a young age. One of the things that, and this is true for all Christian parents, but one of the things that Beth and I really try to emphasize is instilling in our children a love not only for God but the Scriptures. One goal, I guess you could say, one goal that I have is that by the time our kids are adults and into the world, that they know far more about the Bible than I did at that age. I want them to be equipped, but not only do I want them to be equipped, I want them to have what Solomon is talking about here. I want them to not just have biblical knowledge, but a love for the author of Scripture. Right? I want them to do what he says here. I want them to remember him. I want them to, every trial they face, every time they get into difficulty, or even on the flip side of that, every time of rejoicing, every victory in their life. I want them to be able to take that back to Christ. And I want them to have that foundation because if you can, again, going back to Solomon's point, if you can get that while you're young, right, it makes it so much easier when you get older to turn back to what you've always known and what you've always done. And so this is the emphasis of Solomon here in the beginning half of chapter 12. And again, remember, this is all on the heels of all the stuff that he's talked about in the previous 11 chapters. I guess you could say 10 and a half chapters, but talking about, again, all the vanities, right, to use that word, all of these things that he's talked about. Well, instead of focusing all that, focus on this. Draw your attention here. And so it's appropriate that he ends this final chapter, that he ends with this thought. And then to close out the whole book, we look at verse 8 on, and he returns to his opening thesis. It takes us all the way back to chapter 1, but also we've seen this phrase, throughout the entirety of the book. Vanity of vanity, saith the preacher, all is vanity. But now he kind of pushes back on this thought. He's talked about the things that really are truly vain, pointless, meaningless, have no thought, have no weight to them. He's talked about these throughout the whole book. And so he kind of comes back to this, but he kind of pushes back against this thought now. Now, verse 9, he says, and moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yea, he gave good heed, and he sought out, and he set in order many proverbs. So what is he? He knows there's so many vanities. And so because there's so many vanities, he's pushing back in it. So I'm going to teach using my wisdom. I'm going to preach. I'm going to give wisdom. I'm going to give people knowledge. How did he do that? Well, he says at the end of verse 9, he set in order many proverbs. This entire book has been a testament to this. This is what he's been doing. He's been warning people about the vanities, and now, pointing them to, as we talked about at the beginning, to that beyond the sun mindset. And so with these words of wisdom, then, Solomon intends to guide us, and he intends to stay with us. And this is where you get verse 11 and 12. The words of the wise are as goads and as nails fastened by the masters of assemblies, which are given from one shepherd. And further, by these, my son, be admonished. Of making many books there is no end, and much study there is a weariness of the flesh. And so these words of wisdom, Solomon says, they're like goads, but they're like nails in the hands of a master. What is a goad? A goad is an instrument that the shepherd would use to kind of guide an animal, right? Particularly strong animals, because an ox or something, you only have so much strength that you can use to guide an ox to go where you want. But a goad would be, in practical terms, it's a long stick with a very sharp point at the end. And so if the animal's starting to go where you don't want it to go, you goad them, you prick them, you stick them, and they go the direction you want them to go. And so what does the goad do? It guides, it directs. And so Solomon says that's what these words should do, and then he adds to that, but they're also nails, but not just any nails. I love that he adds this. They're nails fastened by the masters of assemblies. These are not nails just in the hands of an amateur carpenter. No, these are nails in the hands of a master craftsman. And if you just follow the guidance of these words, it'll take you where Solomon is hoping you'll wind up, and the intended end. And then before he gets to his final kind of conclusion, he gives one more word of wisdom here in verse 12, where he I guess you could say he warns. He warns of searching for this wisdom in the never-ending pile of books outside of Scripture. Now, today, obviously, you could add to that the internet and all other kinds of technology. But obviously in Solomon's day, and still by a large degree in our day, there are a lot of other places that people tend to look when it comes to finding out wisdom and other things. Now, Solomon is not trying to say that there is no wisdom to be found outside of Scripture. He's not trying to say every fact that you could ever need to learn is found within the pages of the Bible. That's not what he's trying to say. But what he is trying to say is that we need to be careful with the time that we invest in seeking out the other wisdom, I guess you could say, the wisdom that is outside of Scripture. And to understand that ultimately our authority and, beyond that, the only divine wisdom is found nowhere else than in the Scriptures. And so even the wisdom, the knowledge that is to be gained, and in some cases should be gained, and sources outside of the Scripture, it all must come from a biblical lens. In other words, that yes, there are many things that you can learn outside of the Bible, but even that needs to be filtered through a biblical lens to make sure that this is God-honoring wisdom and not wisdom that is just worldly in nature. And so Solomon ends with this warning before reaching his final conclusion. And I mentioned this, and I know it's been a while, but I mentioned this at the very beginning, I think even in the introduction, that Solomon's conclusion, if you kind of don't understand his argument, Solomon's conclusion might be a surprising one. It's probably not what most people think he would end on, because he's been building this whole case about the vanity of the world, and then he finally gets to chapter 12, and he's talking about the Creator, right, moving beyond the world, moving beyond the vanity, and you might think he's going to end on this kind of high, beautiful note, and honestly he does, but in an unexpected manner. In verses 13 and 12, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. And so finally he says, if he's teaching somebody and he's been going through this whole experiment, he finally comes and says, this is the whole conclusion. Everything rests on this. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Why are we here? What are we supposed to be doing? Why is the world vain? Why are there things in this world that don't hold any weight? You know, what are the things that do? All of it lends itself to this conclusion: fear God and keep his commandments. And so unlike all the pleasures, possessions, toils, work, riches, earthly wisdom that he has spent all the time in this book speaking about, and ultimately all lead to vanity, this is that has no value. What holds value in this world? Fearing God and keeping his commandments, right? And so Solomon has spent a lot of time, and I think it's almost poetic in nature. He has spent so much time talking about that which is vain, that which has no value. And then he's got just a few short, kind of terse statements at the end, telling us if you want value in your life, here's how you find it. And why I say I think it's almost poetic in nature that he does this is because man, in our attempts to find God on our own, or to find pleasure on our own, or to find some kind of spiritual enlightenment on our own, are going to try and do so many things whenever the Bible simply says it's so simple. There's nothing you can do. It's by grace through faith. And so I think Solomon is kind of emulating the busyness of life and the busyness of those who are trying to seek out divine wisdom without turning to the source, when in fact it's really quite simple what it is we've been asked to do. Fear God, keep his commandments. And then finally, we do that. Fear God, keep his commandments. We do that not for what we will gain from it, but ultimately we do so for God. Now notice the word for there, right? He's drawing in verse 13. In verse 14, the word for is bringing us back. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. And so this is what he ends on. Why do we fear God? Why do we keep his commandments? Because one day judgment is coming. Because one day judgment is coming. And this is the ultimate truth that he ends on, is this fact of judgment. Now Solomon does not take the time to go into the ins and outs of this. Here's when judgment will be. Here's who will be judged. Here's how the judgment will happen. Here's the judge. He doesn't go into that. He just simply says, God is going to bring every work into judgment. All of it. Good, bad, evil, all of it. And so he just lets this profound truth just kind of ring in the air and ends with this very profound and bold statement. And so I want to quote Kidner again, and he's referencing Habakkuk 2:13. And so let me read that. Habakkuk 2:13 says, Behold, is it not of the Lord of hosts that the people shall labor in the very fire, and the people shall weary themselves for very vanity? And so Kidner is referencing that. And he says, it is a very different thing to be under a master to whom the worker and the work both matter deeply, and whose judgment is unerring. And so contrary to the individual whom Solomon has been writing about this whole time, who is wearying themselves, go back to Habakkuk 2, wearying themselves for vanity, seeking out all these things that ultimately hold no eternal or spiritual value. No, Kidner says it's a different thing to be under a master to whom the work and the worker both matter deeply, and whose judgment is unerring. And so Solomon ends by telling us that there is much more, there is so much more than that which is under the sun, right? And so this whole book, he's been kind of slowly peeling back the surface here. He's been showing us all these things that exist in this world, and all the ways that people can find themselves heavily involved in ultimately vain projects or circumstances. And then finally here at the end, he just kind of pulls the rug away and just opens our eyes to the full picture and shows us, no, there's so much more out there, right? There's a creator whom you ought to be serving, who you ought to be remembering. There's a creator who you ought to fear and you ought to obey. And the reason why you ought to fear and obey this creator is because judgment ultimately is coming. And so don't bog yourself down with all the vanities that life can and will offer. Instead, just be focused on that which is going to bring ultimate and eternal joy and pleasure, not the temporal things of this earth. And you do so by fearing God and keeping his commandments. And so the very creator of the sun will one day stand in judgment over us. And when we can truly consider this, Christian, non-Christian alike, if you truly consider the fact that one day we will stand in judgment before our Creator. Now, I'll just add as an aside, for Christians, that's going to be a very different judgment than for non-Christians. But one day we will all stand in judgment before our very Creator. And when we consider this, it should spur us to live for the Son of God instead of for the vanity that is found under the sun that Solomon has spent so much time talking about. And so, again, a really interesting close to what has been at times a highly practical, at other times almost a, I don't want to say depressing, but you know, Solomon gets to the realities of life, and sometimes it looks really dark and bleak, but there's a purpose behind it all, which was to show us live with the real purpose, you know, live for the purpose that matters. And so a very, very fascinating and interesting end to what has been a fascinating and interesting book. And so I am I'm glad to have had the chance to go through this book. As I've mentioned several times, having never really taken the time to get into it with any depth before. And it has really opened my eyes to a lot of things that I just had never really even considered before with regards to